Good afternoon, and on behalf of the Office of Interdisciplinary Studies, Ideas at OP Jindal Global University, I welcome you all to today's masterclass session with Professor Naresh Singh on disrupting conventional notions of development. This masterclass seminar series has been a core component of our MSc program, where we invite scholars, academics, researchers, as well as development practitioners from India as well as all across the world in order to bridge this gap between classroom learning and the more lived in the development realm. We do also online sessions on Saturdays and also in-person ones on Wednesday here at JIA, that is Jindal International Academy at Taj Mansingh. Today's session with Professor Singh is very special because Professor Singh has been very central in not just conceptualizing but also designing this MSc development practice program. So sir's guidance has been there all along since the very beginning. Dr. Naresh Singh is Professor and Executive Dean at the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. He is also the Director of the Center for Complexity Economics, Applied Spirituality and Public Policy. Dr. Singh has nearly 30 years of experience as an international development practitioner and advisor with a special focus on sustainable livelihoods, poverty, environment, and legal empowerment. More recently, he has been working as an independent consultant in international development with a focus on livelihoods in conflict countries. Previously, he was principal advisor at UNDP, headquartered on poverty and sustainable livelihoods, and before that, he was program director for community adaptation and sustainable livelihoods at the International Institute for Sustainable Development in Canada. He's a specialist in development program design and evaluation. Dr. Singh has held several other distinguished posts and responsibilities. From 2006 to 2008, he served as the executive director of the Commission on Legal Empowerment of the Poor, co-chaired by Madeleine Albright and Hernando de Soto. From 2002 to 2011, he was a Director General and Acting Vice President at the Canadian International Development Agency, and then was Program Director for the Caribbean Local Economic Development Program with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. He has worked in more than 50 countries and written several books and journal articles. He has been visiting scholar and professor at several universities in North America, including Boston University, Harvard, McGill, and Waterloo. Dr. Singh is currently honorary visiting professor in the School of Government and Public Policy at JGU, as I mentioned earlier, and also Senior Associate Research Fellow at Middle East Research Institute in Iraq, and LLM Thesis Supervisor and Lecturer at Loyola University of Chicago, Rome campus. In his talk today, Professor Singh will argue that development is an organic, non-linear process, one that cannot be effectively understood or delivered through rigid, project-based or linear frameworks. Drawing on systems thinking and complexity theory, he will explore how a deeper understanding of human nature and consciousness is essential for achieving truly sustainable and equitable development. On this note, I welcome Professor Singh for his thoughts. So you will be having roughly say 35 to 40 minutes. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Prachi. I almost didn't recognize myself when you did that introduction, because some of those things, been a while now. Nevertheless, thanks very much for that generous introduction. So, I should say up front that if I have any claim to any kind of fame in the development field, it'll be for two things. So I led the work globally that led to something called sustainable livelihoods in development work. When we started that work, there was one paper in the literature in 1992 written by Chambers and Conway. It was called Sustainable Livelihoods Concepts for the 21st Century Development. And since our work, which we did for about 4 or 5 years, and then DFID in the UK picked it up, and a lady called Claire Short liked what we were doing, and she put $500 million, 500 million pounds sterling into sustainable livelihoods, and it became world famous. So that's one thing I might mention. And the other thing is something called legal empowerment of the poor. I was not chaired, I was the executive director of a commission, as you heard, which was co-chaired by Madeleine Albright and Hernando de Soto. And Madeleine Albright, some of you, you're all young people, you would probably not know that name. Anybody knows that name? Madeleine Albright, you've heard? Older people might. So she was the first woman Secretary of State of the United States under Bill Clinton presidency. Bill Clinton cannot be forgotten, right? I don't think. He was a colorful president, put it that way. So those, and then, that work became worldwide recognized. So those two things, some contributions. But along the way, I have thought hard and long about how development works, and that's what I'll share with you today. So I want to say that when I think about development, I think both about international development cooperation, in which I worked for many, many years, but I also think about local organic development within countries, and I think about that as a nested system of scales. So you start with the individual who lives in a household. That household exists in a village or a town. That town exists in a district or a municipality, which is in a state, which is in a country, which is on the planet. And they are all interacting. Each level is autonomous, right? Because as an individual or in a household, you make decisions on your own, but you also listen to others in that household making decisions. And you learn to work and live together. So right away, you are working in a relational way. And it goes all the way down, up and down. So to summarize that, one might say, at each level, you have autonomous but interdependent actors. That's the phrase that summarizes it. And that's how I think about development and the organic process. So let me tell you what I've come to learn, and then we can debate whether these things make sense or not. I will share with you these few ideas. Can you hear me if I don't use the mic, or it's recording? Huh? So
It's recording.
Yeah, okay. All right, that's fine. I will talk from here. That's fine. I can see the board. So I want to talk to you about these 6 things.
You need a handle mic, mobile mic.
If I can walk around with
Yeah,
it,
yeah.
then otherwise I am pasted to this little podium here. So. Right, so we don't have much time, so let me proceed. Thanks. Right, so the the 6 ideas I want to share with you are on the board, on the screen. One is nonlinearity. That is to say, in development work, development goes all jerks and lurches and backward movements and all a messy thing. But human beings can't teach anything that goes in jerks and bounds and leaps and forward and backward. That's how it works. But we can't do that, so we make it linear. Because then it's simple. But it doesn't represent anything. So when you hear the logical framework, something called a log frame, you will know that that was a simplified way of thinking that does not represent reality. That's the first point. We'll come and talk about it. So we need systems thinking. I introduced you to what I mean by systems. This hierarchy, individuals in households and right? So we will talk systems thinking. But some systems are complex. And I'll tell you what I mean by complex. And what's the difference between complex and complicated? But people in development work don't always think about the system of development as a complex system. And I do not mean complicated. Complex and complicated are very different things. And we'll talk about that, right? How do we deal with uncertainty? So one way to deal with uncertainty is to ignore it, which is what most people do. It's there, but I can't do anything about it, so let's proceed, right? Or like my friend, my colleague Sudeep Patra will say, shut up and calculate, right? So that's another way to deal with it. We'll talk a little bit about how development practitioners should deal with uncertainty in decision making. Now I'm working with 2 other areas which might be of interest to you. I'll introduce it a little bit and tell you why I think it's important. We are calling it consciousness studies, we are calling it applied spirituality, and so on. Commonly, we are calling it applied spirituality, but not to do with religion. It has to do with understanding yourself. And then finally, if we bring it all together, we might get a new frame, which I'm trying to get published, but this is not yet published, which I will introduce a new frame in the literature called integral public policy. So that's what I want to share with you. Now, before we start, obviously we must have a common understanding of what is development, what is its purpose. So anybody wants to tell me what is this thing you're studying? You will get this high-level degree, a master's degree in something called development. What is it? What's the purpose of all this development stuff? Anybody? How would you define it? Or how do you measure it then? That makes it easier. Anybody can offer me anything? You must have done that on day one of your class. You forgot. That's a long time ago.
The definition might be very complex. However, the purpose of development is very basic in nature, which is to provide basic, infrastructure,
Services.
services
To
to
people.
to the masses.
Right. So that's one way to define development. But how do we measure that? We'll have to figure that out. So I'll offer you a few thoughts, see if these resonate with you or not. So one thought is that development is measured. If a country is showing increases GDP per capita, then we say it's developing. That's one way to do it. Well, that clearly is one way, but it might have some limitations, some shortcomings, right? The GDP per capita measure has been under intense debate for a long time. But it was the way development was measured. Going back to the economists like Arthur Lewis and so on, they all measure development in terms of GDP per capita increases for people living in poverty, right? So another one that we must bear in mind, development need not be quantitative. Something cannot grow forever. When you hear the phrase sustainable growth, it means that growth must be sustained forever. It's not feasible. Something is going to collapse and topple over. If anything is growing and growing and growing, it's going to get so big one day it was going to topple, right? So we have to be careful when we are talking about growth. And growth and development, I'm sure you can distinguish between those two. Anybody here cannot distinguish between growth, economic growth, and economic development? You can all distinguish. Okay, so then I don't have to go into that. So I will say that another purpose is a transformative process of social, economic, cultural, political change in which people become better off, right? Which is what you just said. What measured by what? Well-being, we just said that. Happiness, we are now talking about measuring development in happiness. Income levels has always been with us. And in some countries, they talk about social mobility. Are you going up? Is this generation better off than the previous generation? Some famous politician had said, when I ask you to vote for me and not my opponent, you must ask yourself the question, are you better off now? That's a long history. Another way of thinking about development is, where are you on the Maslow hierarchy? Hierarchy of needs. You remember that? This triangle. Now, a lot of people who have studied Maslow will stop at self-actualization. And the earlier versions of Maslow did stop at self-actualization. But if you check carefully, the later version, just before he died, he changed the triangle. In fact, Maslow figured out this triangle by talking to the First Nations in Canada, which many people don't know. He spent a long time working and studying the First Nations, if you want to say the Aboriginal people I'm talking about, of Canada, developed that triangle by watching how they lived and what they value. But he finally put in self-transcendence. And that is the link to the work I do now, which is on applied spirituality, that peak which is above self-actualization. So we might say development is to get you to move from the bottom of the Maslow triangle to the top. One way to think about it. So many ways to think about development. So because I will probably share these slides with you, you don't have to read all this stuff. This is not the way any professor should show a slide to students, because you should never make a slide like this when you're presenting. They will fail you. It has too much text, right? But I'm only putting it there because you will read it later on. So each of the levels, if you didn't know what they meant, is defined here, and this goes into a little more detail than what is on that slide. So you might ask, what is the difference between self-actualization and self-transcendence? And that's what I want you to understand. Self-transcendence, Maslow says, is the final highest level where an individual experiences a desire to go beyond the self through spiritual, mystical, or whatever else. And many human beings, and many of my friends who were capitalists and communists and so on, it was amazing for me to observe, and I still observe, as they grow older, how they become spiritual. It's quite an interesting thing. I don't know if they're following the Maslow triangle or what, but you might find that yourself. And I have come to the conclusion that you will not be fulfilled, and development would not have done its job for you, or you do it for yourself, unless you get to that level of self-transcendence. That's the point I'm making. Right, so the next thing I want to say is that development is not technocratic. We treat it as though it is technocratic. And if they're teaching you development studies as though it's technocratic, challenge it. Because it's really an organic process. You know, people exchange things, there are relationships that are at work. Yes, there might be transactions, but more and more, we are realizing that a transactional approach to development leads to more harm than good. And a relational approach is rapidly becoming the way you need to think about development. So, so distinguish between this organic process. Now, in international development cooperation, there's a lot of literature. You will be covering that. So I wouldn't talk about the critique of that and so on very much. I mentioned these two things already, in which I worked a lot. We can talk about it during discussion if you want to learn more about the sustainable livelihoods approach or the legal empowerment of the poor. We do quite a bit of work. We can talk about that. But let me talk about the first thing which I say disrupts development. Why I say that is almost all international development projects, when they come to evaluation, they are evaluated based on a theory of change that says development is a linear process. That is to say that you have some inputs. Those inputs are normally money and people. Money and people carry out some activities. Those activities lead to outputs. When the outputs are used by the would-be beneficiaries, you get outcomes. That's your result. That's what you are measuring in the development process. Very linear. Activities and inputs lead to outputs, which then lead to outcomes. And that's your theory of change. What does that do? That assumes that when you are doing a 5-year development project, well, let me backtrack 1 second. What we are saying is that here is desired existing situation A, there is a desired situation B, and through development, I want to move from situation A to situation B. And the way I will move is through this linear process. But the world is not linear. And while you are doing a 3 or 5 year development project, the world is changing. It's not staying the same. Even a local community is changing all the time. Yet almost all development practitioners in their planning process will assume that that community does not change on its own. It will only change by the interventions you make through your project. I mean, isn't that crazy? Think about it. And if you are taught that and shown that that's the way it is to be done, challenge it. Right. Okay. So we are saying that development is essentially non-linear. It goes in all kinds of wiggly pathways. So then the problem in why we said that development was linear is like the way we did economics. So for long decades we did economics by simplifying out all the complexity until the mathematics would work, right? So we'll mention that in a minute. And it's the same limitation that we did to development. We took out the messiness, we took out the complexity, we made it mathemizable so math can work, we can draw straight lines, we can do regression curves, and we can get Nobel Prizes, which is what we have done. I should mention that there's a guy at Oxford called Doyne Farmer, who is a collaborator with our center. Doyne Farmer heads up a thing called the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And Doyne wrote a book called Making Sense of Chaos. It's an interesting book, it's quite cheap, you should read it. Making Sense of Chaos. And one page I was surprised when I read, he said that he now, on reflection, wonders how so many of his colleagues could have won the Nobel Prize when their economics is so wrong. Isn't that interesting? Not me saying that, I'm not qualified to say that, right? But Doyne Farmer is probably in line for a Nobel himself. He might not get it now that he has said that. But it's interesting. And I know that many of you are economists, including Professor Mohan. But we can challenge each other on these ideas, no matter. That's how it is, right? Right, Professor Mohan? That's how we all learn from each other. So the first big thing is that we have, in development work, made the assumption of linearity. It's not linear, it's non-linear, and we know more and more how to do that. How to do it? You use complex adaptive systems thinking. Okay. Also context. You know, in the UN, I've served many years in the UN, as in many places. One of the words that we used to have in the UN a lot was best practice. In a lot of development circles, you hear the concept of best practice. Have you followed best practice? Best practice is only valid for the context in which it worked. And if you want to make it applicable to a different context, you strip it off its original context and you make it generalizable, right? Which is what we are all forced to do. So the famous question, are your results generalizable? And if they are not really important. So we were taught. So remember that in most development work, the context is critical. And to take what works in one context and transplant it in another one might not work. If the contexts are virtually identical, even then it doesn't work, because something is going to be different there. How people think, how people history, because it's path dependent. Where community A is today and community B, they arrive there through different pathways. And path dependency is common in complex adaptive systems. Now, today's world, we have these phrases are coming up. These crazy phrases, VUCA and BANI. Anybody heard about VUCA or BANI? So VUCA came up from the United States Army after the end of the Cold War. You know, it was all good when we had the Cold War because the United States had one enemy, which was Russia. When the Cold War ended, boom, no enemy. What do we do now? Who do we fight? So they developed this concept called, they said the world was VUCA. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. That's the description of the world we live in. Now when you think about it, they're quite right. World has become volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, or at least more so than it was in the past. So the private sector, that was in the public sector. The private sector guys wouldn't be left behind. They came up with BANI. B-A-N-I. What is BANI? BANI is brittle, anxious, non-linear, and incomprehensible. Imagine the management consultants in the corporate sector describe the world as BANI. Now, if that's the description of the world, can we really be making planning and policy and not take that? Well, you can critique it, see whether the world fits that description or not. And you might find that it's closer to that description than not. Maybe not fully so, right? And so we have to make public policy and we have to do development in that kind of sphere. So the next thing that leads us to then is to work in systems. And what it means is that you have to understand interrelationships and you have to understand the whole system. And that's the first thing I did when I introduced my talk. You know, the individual, in the household, right through. And development must work at each level. But no aspect, none of this level is independent of the other level. That's the issue. Individual within the household, that individual is dependent on the household, but the household is also dependent on the individual. So if you get that clear, then my talk would not have been wasted. Even that little understanding. Similarly, the household is dependent on the community. But the community is also dependent on the household. And we can trace that interdependency at all levels of the development scale. So when you talk scaling up, and you do mechanical or engineering type scaling out for social and economic processes, you'll get it wrong. Because the relationship changes at each scale of the system that you are working on, which is a social and economic system typically. Right? So that's the argument. So if you don't do systems thinking, in order to get development outcomes, they either will not be sustainable, they might appear to be valid for a little while, and then they will grow some cancers. It's going to be hurtful in the long run. So that's the second thing. And we have not used systems thinking. And ask your professors why they don't use systems thinking if they don't in development. Is it not obvious that that's how the world is? People are in households. Household depends on the individuals. Individuals depend on the rest of the household. To me, it's common sense, no? It's obvious. It's happening around you all the time. Well, how come we don't do development like that? So the system is always more than its parts. And when you think about capacity building, that's really a phrase that we all like to use. And then we don't say when we say capacity building, what dimension of capacity, who has responsibility, for what purpose. We love to say strengthening capacity. It's a nice thing to say. And we all quote Amartya Sen, who was our guru and mentor, about capabilities and functions, and somebody will tell you that. But how does this capability idea work in the kind of system, the hierarchy structure that I'm telling you about? It is not as though it was a linear approach. And I think implicitly, Sen assumed a linear approach, although he doesn't say so in his writing, because everything was considered in linear terms back in the day. So we need to bear those in mind, and even for evaluations. And when I say this, I'm not just speaking as an academic. You have heard, I've spent about 30 years doing this stuff on the ground, and the last 10 years, I've been evaluating international development projects, and I teach a course at the University of Ottawa on monitoring and evaluation of international development programs and projects. And they still continue to make these linear assumptions. And when you teach these students, they then reflect and they say, wow, how can the world be so messed up? Well, that's how we are. But you guys are going to change it, right? Because you are going to this famous university and you're doing, master's degree and so on. Fix all this problem. That's why I came here today. So, to get you guys on board with me. So the next thing is, why is it I talk about complexity? So everybody, what is this guy always talking about complexity? The world is simple. My life is already too complex and he's making more complexity. So let me tell you why I talk about complexity. See, complex systems are different from linear systems. These are the characteristics. You recall the assumptions of neoclassical economics, right? You remember them? I don't have it on the board somewhere. I always have it on the board somewhere, but I'm talking now about full rationality, full information sets. Everything either is in equilibrium or tends to equilibrium. All that I live for is maximizing my utility and self-interest, those kinds of things. And everything will be able to be reduced to y is equal to mx plus c, or some form with a log or something, and straighten it out, right? Then we are able to do regression analysis. Complexity theory says that the system we are dealing with is nonlinear, that things happen on their own, self-organization, that new things come out all the time, called emergence, that things are adapting all the time, and these are the characteristics that we have learned how to work with. Now let me tell you the difference between complex and complicated. So in a way that you will understand and carry it with you for a long time. So complicated is like sending a rocket to the moon, right? Very complicated. So to Chandrayaan-3 to land on the dark side of the moon, that's a really major effort those guys had to do to get that to happen. There was a lot of analytical, technical work, really top-class scientists, good computer models. All of this had to be done, and then you get the rocket to go and land on the moon. And then you can write a manual on how this is to be done, and you can test it, and you will get it better and better. Blueprint can be developed. So that's really complicated. Now what's complex? Complex is like bringing up a child. So all of you would have seen children growing up, or some of you might even have brought up a child, I don't know. So if a parents had one child, and they brought up that child, and the child grew up really nicely. Child is great at everything that they want the child to be, right? So they learned something when they were bringing up the child. Now they get child number 2. And they say, I know exactly how to bring up children, because I got the first one right. Now they apply exactly the same strategy to bring up child number 2, like in the rocket. So they should be taken away for child abuse, right? Because each child is a unique organism growing and driven by 2 things: its genetic structure and its environment. And the only way you can successfully bring up a child is by constant observation. As the child is changing, you are also changing, and you are co-evolving together, and that leads to success. Constant learning, adjustment, adaptation. So complex systems are systems which evolve, they change all the time, they are dynamic in nature. The only way you can deal with them is by observation, learning, evolution, and adjustment. And my argument is that that's how development works. The development process needs to be observed, adjusted, you need to learn. You can't make blueprints up front and set up a plan in which you must deliver at all costs on the outcomes of that plan. A guy called William Easterly, who you might read, has an article on searchers versus planners, in which the planner establishes a blueprint, and you follow that blueprint to get your result. The searcher is searching for results constantly, like in bringing up the child. So don't ever confuse complicated and complex, right? And I think, and I hope you will agree with me, that development is a complex system rather than complicated. All right. So that's the second or third idea, whatever it is. The next thing is dealing with uncertainty. So in development work, there's lots of uncertainty. You don't know if the government will change. Oh, I should stop soon. All right. We started at 3:15. My talk started, so another 10 minutes or so. Yeah. So dealing with uncertainty. How do you deal with uncertainty in the development process? It's not an easy thing to do if you think about uncertainty just as a single monolithic idea. Most likely you brush it under the carpet. But when you unpackage it, you get insights on how to deal with uncertainty. So I will suggest that we deal with 4 types of uncertainty to make it manageable. Put it that way, manageable, right? The first one is epistemological uncertainty. Uncertainty that is there because we don't have enough information or knowledge. And the way you deal with that is to go find the information or the knowledge. How do you do that? You do a literature review. If the literature doesn't have, you have a literature gap. Then you do further research, data collection, experiment, models, and you can fill the epistemological gap. First one is easy to deal with. Second one is the uncertainty that arises because the world is random. You know the famous statement, things fall apart? Some famous writer had said things fall apart. Who did so? Right, right. The center will not hold, right? Okay. But why is it that the center will not hold? You know, you leave anything, it doesn't get better, it just falls apart, it breaks up, it gets old. Even we, as individuals, we all fall apart. We get older and older and older, our hair falls away, your hair gets gray, and all kinds of things happen to you, and you finally die. Or you leave a house, you go to Kolkata, nobody here from Kolkata, right? You're all from Delhi. So I visited many cities in India, and then I go to the famous Kolkata where all my good friends are. And then I see a city in which you have all these decrepit looking buildings. They are so old, I don't know how they're standing. So I'm puzzled. All these intellectuals that I've met who are from Bengal, and here you have a city that looks really like it's falling apart. But those buildings don't get newer over time, they get older over time. So in science, we say it follows the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy increases, that is to say disorder increases. Order does not increase by itself, only disorder does. So the world is random. Chaos increases, not decreases. But we know how to deal with that. We deal with it by statistics and probability theory. So probability, we can deal with the randomness nature of the world. That's the second source of uncertainty. The random nature of the world dealt with by probability. The third one is radical uncertainty. Radical uncertainty cannot be dealt with by either of these two because the system is complex, it is generating uncertainty, and when you try to measure or control the uncertainty, it increases that uncertainty. That's a different type. We call it radical. And there are many descriptions, but one quick one I should tell you is, there's a book called Radical Uncertainty, written by Mervyn King and John Kay. It's really easy to read. And Mervyn King is an important guy to read because he was in the room, you know, when we had the 2008 financial crisis. The Queen invited in her top economists from the UK for a short meeting, she said she will have with them. So they all were assembled there, including the Nobel Prize winners of the UK and so on. And then she said, I have one question for you. The question is, how come none of you saw the financial crisis coming? That was the question. So all these top economists looked at each other and nobody could say a word. They were all mum. So Mervyn King was in that room. He was the governor of the Central Bank of the UK. Afterwards, he wrote the book. That is our fault. We do economics in a different way. And we don't. In fact, the big mistake we make is that we treat radical uncertainty by probabilistic theory, and we get it wrong all the time. Huh. So this goes back a long way of Frank Knight, I think was his name, and so on. Those guys in economic, whoever teaches you economic history will tell you about the origin of this idea long time ago. Professor Mohan, I think, knows that much better than I do. So the radical uncertainty is there, but then we have psychological uncertainty is the fourth one. This is the human internal doubt, when you're doubting yourself. And that one you have to do your own little thing on yourself to figure out your uncertainty. Your uncertainty arises because you don't know who you are. That's what I will argue. Anybody can answer the question, what am I? If I ask you, who are you? Answer the question, who am I?
That is probably, that the answer lies in the last, the topmost.
Aha, it lies there, right. And it lies in what Ramana Maharshi has been saying, and what everybody else from the Upanishads 3,000 years ago to now have been saying, and we have forgotten. That's where it lies. Yeah. So think about, where does your doubt arise from? Psychological doubt. It's a mixture of psychology and spirituality. All right, so a little bit on uncertainty. And we published a paper. The UNDP put out a paper in fact, the Human Development Report dealt with uncertainty. They called it Uncertain Times, Unsettled Lives, just after the pandemic. And we read that report and we found that they had not dealt with uncertainty properly. So we did a critique of that report. Unfortunately, we got it published in a good journal. And that paper is the one. I don't have the, this one, yes. This paper here by Singh and others. We wrote that paper. It deals with the lack of understanding of even the UNDP of dealing with uncertainty. UN Development Program, right? Okay. So there are some shifts taking place. I wouldn't take too much of your time on this. You know this. These shifts are moving from neoclassical economics to behavioral economics, which is an important shift, I think. It's helpful in development work. And from behavioral economics, we have now moved to something now called behavioral public policy. This is a new field which I hope to bring into our school, the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, where we will start teaching behavioral public policy, which builds partly from behavioral economics, but it also builds on behavioral science. One of the books written by Cass Sunstein, but a book in 2013 already had written about behavioral policy. So a recent conference, I think, held at either London or Oxford, is called the International Conference on Behavioral Public Policy. It's becoming a discipline. So we will bring that in. That's a big shift in development work, which I think is at the leading edge, which you should make sure you're doing it. To deal with the limitations of neoclassical economics, complexity economics is now a subject in its own right, and it tackles all the limitations of the assumptions that neoclassical economics makes. And there are many books now written on it. Brian Arthur gave a talk to our school some time ago. We know him well. We know most of the leaders in the field. Now I'm going to wrap up on this. This guy, what is on the board, Gus Pett, who said this, is the guy who hired me to work at the UNDP. He was the administrator at that time. And Gus did a lot of big things after that. He became the dean of the School of Forestry at Yale, and he was the director of the World Resources Institute and so on. So he's somebody that is respectable enough to listen to, no? And he said that I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity and ecosystem collapse and climate change. I thought with 30 years of good science, we could solve those problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. When I finished my PhD in environmental sciences, So I am one of those guys. It immediately struck me that we had a kind of a nonsense approach. We talk about environmental management. Imagine that. So many universities have departments of environmental management. But the environment doesn't need to be managed. You leave the environment and see how it will do. It will get better and better. It doesn't damage itself. It's the greatest show on earth. It regenerates, it's constantly creative. So where's the problem? We are the problem. So it's human management, not environmental management. So that's where I have ended up. It was strange that Gus ended up exactly where I ended up. And he had hired me and wanted me to stay on at the UNDP, but we were both too radical, I guess, to stay there for too long. So in order to do that, so this is another guy you might have heard of, not Gus Pett now, but Sri Aurobindo. And he says for the most vital issue of the age is whether the future progress of humanity is to be governed by modern economic and materialistic mind of the West, or by a nobler pragmatism, guided, uplifted, and enlightened by a spiritual culture and knowledge. So I take one from the West and one from the East, so you can't doubt me now, right? I'm very well rounded. And hence we have introduced a new area of work and research and teaching. So we teach a course called Applied Spirituality, Sustainable Development. We wrote a book which is published and Scopus Index. Professor Rajkumar is not here, but he knows the book is Scopus Indexed. Yeah. You guys all know about that, right? That's a famous thing in our university. So the book is called Applied Spirituality and Sustainable Development Policy. It's on this subject. And it is because I have come to the conclusion, like many others, that if we don't have a deeper understanding of ourselves, we cannot get sustainable development right. That's the issue. See, even with complex systems, for a long time I thought I had it right with complex adaptive systems. It looked so brilliant and beautiful, it had to be right. But I was still seeing that as the system out there, and I was here, and I can manipulate that system whatever way I want to make it work better. That was an error. That was wrong. I am in the system. I am the system. It is me, not the thing out there to develop or to protect. Right? So that's, I think, the final point I wanted to make. We can use these kinds of things to bring it all together in integral public policy. You see, it has everything here now, the individual internal consciousness, external behavior, collective internal, and we have an anthropologist here with us, which is culture and anthropology, which is the internal collective, and then the systems like complex systems that we are talking about. So I'm not saying pick any one, these four have to work together. And that is what is leading towards integral public policy, but two journals have refused our paper because they figure this thing is not public policy, which, because nobody has done this before, somebody has to be. We'll continue to struggle. One day we'll make it. And we're bringing in a few new ideas into this: narrative public policy, participatory, quantum social science, and complex adaptive systems. When you bring all of that stuff into public policy journal, nobody will review it and say, yes, this will work. In conclusion, this is my last slide. Let me just say that we have some new terminology because what the world is facing is not well explained by existing terminology. We have the concept of wicked policy problems, which I teach to my MAPP or Masters in Public Policy students. Wicked policy problems are problems that have no solution. Every time you apply a solution to a wicked policy problem, that solution turns out to be a problem of another problem. So it creates a problem as it tends to solve a part of it. So it's like a multi-headed monster. You chop off one head and the two other heads arise. What are some examples of wicked policy? Climate change, poverty, malnutrition, youth unemployment. They seem to go on forever. Since I was born, they were there. They're still here. Climate change wasn't there. But I started with climate change 30 years ago, and we're still where we, almost still where we were. Now they introduce words like polycrisis. Each individual crisis is now entangling with the other crisis, like economic inequality and climate change and human health, all entangling, getting polycrisis. When you bring in the internal human dimension to the external crisis, we are talking now of the meta crisis. All the development knowledge you need have been summarized by development agencies, like the toolkit that DFID from the UK just put out. Very interesting toolkit. They bring all the knowledge that they have gathered over the last 50, 60 years, more than that. Development started. You know the date when international development started? Ah, excellent. 21st of January, 1949. He said to the world, you are underdeveloped, we are developed, we will set up US aid to make you like us. And all the economists believed him. That was a political speech, and they start figuring out theories of underdevelopment. So when you study international political economy, go back to Truman and see where it all started, and how we all believe this nonsense that he pushed at us. And then I've told you about how to fix all these issues by disrupting what you will be taught. That's the message. Thank you very much. All right, we have half hour.
Thank you so much, Professor Singh. It was very, very interesting, and especially, I think your focus,
And then I can.
especially your focus on the concept of applied spirituality. I'm sure it gives us so much more to think about, a dimension that we hadn't really discussed or explored as of now as students of development, but certainly something very novel. So we'd open it up for questions or remarks or reflections, if there's any, from the participants. And then, yeah, Professor Singh can respond to those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hope you have some hard questions.
Just introduce yourself.
Please introduce yourselves first and then maybe the question.
Good afternoon, sir. I am Pakhi. I am a final year student of political science at LSR, and I am associated with the Center for New Economic Studies, where I work as a student researcher. So my question to you has to do with the discursive understanding of development. So when we look at development as a hegemonic discursive idea, people say that the system is broken, but we realize that system is not broken. It was designed to work this way, right? And it still acts as a hegemonic discourse that dictates social engineering projects. How do we then transcend this hegemonic understanding of development as a project to render alternatives visible to development?
Very good. Excellent. I did say big hard questions, and you took me literally, yeah? Very nice. So I'll tell you how. This is how you do it. So you need to rethink the foundations of that hegemonic structure, which established through discursive processes, but all making assumptions that are not valid. And these are the ways to intervene. Look at the system through a non-linear lens, through a complex adaptive system in which you can see emergence, you can see self-organization at work, you can see the organic process that is at work, and not the system that was designed by the way you have described. How do you deal with uncertainty? And then you bring in the internal dimensions of the human that interacts constantly. So at our level of consciousness, we have a fragmented consciousness, most of us. We see things in bits and parts because of 400 years of conditioning, you know, from the days of Newton, Descartes, and Bacon to now. I think with this kind of what I call disruptors, you will be able to fix it. Anyone? But excellent question. Yeah.
Maybe I'll I find this idea of applied spirituality very interesting.
Yeah.
But if we look at it as students of development, so don't you think it makes the problems, development problems, very individualistic in nature? So how do we like respond to deeper, like power structures or larger structural problems or those hierarchies that are embedded in the international sphere as well? So I mean, how does that work? Have you
Tell
thought
you.
that through?
In fact, I would argue that without applied spirituality, we have no chance of ending the individualism. Rather than it supporting, it will lead to an end of the individualism. How does it do this? When you understand your own true nature, how do you do that? So, a quick lesson. I'm no spiritual teacher. I learned from the spiritual teachers myself. But I'll tell you how it's done. It's done by a process called neti in Sanskrit, meaning not this, not that. So humans find it very difficult to figure out who they are, but they can figure out what they are not. So when you do that process, you figure out, I am not my body, because who is it that's saying my body? It can't be the body, right? That wouldn't make any sense. So I'm not my body, I'm not my thoughts, I'm not my mind, I'm not my intellect. All these things I have, they're not me. So you eliminate. You keep eliminating, and you will end up at a strange place, then you will figure out who you are. I leave that to you to do. What you are likely to find, do it for yourself and see if you get there, maybe emptiness, nothingness, because you have eliminated everything. When you get there to this nothingness, is not nothing, it is no thing. You come to the understanding that you're not a thing. Ultimately, you are part of the divine consciousness, or cosmic don't use the word divine, but that leads us into gods and all kind of things. Cosmic consciousness, let's use secular language. We share a common consciousness. That's the first thing you come to understand. The second thing you understand is that this separation that we see between you and me is a very small part of reality. We have more in common. If you do the genome, you will find that we are 99% identical, all humans. We also share this consciousness. This separation between nature and humans, and between human and human, is an illusion. It is led by this ego structure. That's what applied spirituality makes you understand. So now you understand that separation is an illusion, that you have much more in common. It is the way to get rid of this false individuality and to get unity. It's the only way we will get unity. So it's the complete opposite of what you think it was. It will work so much better. Then, of course, we can look at collective consciousness, how that works. We can look at collective illusions. There's a book called Collective Illusions that you have to guard against. It's not an automatic panacea, but I think it has much greater potential of understanding unity, of understanding macro structures. Religion might be individual, but not spirituality. Spirituality is a universal thing. It doesn't matter where you come from. It has nothing to do with religion. Fortunately, when we check all the world's great religions, the understanding at the mystical core is the same. The teachings of the spiritual dimension of Islam, Sufism, the mystical core of Christianity. I'm not talking now with the Gospels, but I'm talking of the teachings of St. John of the Cross, Teresa d'Avila, Thomas Merton, Thomas Keating. All of these people have gone to the core of mystical Christianity. They teach the same thing. Look at Advaita Vedanta, look at Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, or Ubuntu. All teach the same thing. So then we know we are on the right track. Then we look at modern neuroscience. Then we look at complexity thinking. Then we look at quantum-like science, all pointing in the same direction. Then we know from a secular standpoint that we got to be right. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I totally understand the depth and complexity of what you're saying, right? And I also agree to it in a lot of ways. But I mean, since you also mentioned climate crisis, right? And a lot of these problems which are very urgent, that need to be addressed with a lot of urgency. So, I mean, I understand. I don't want to, what you're putting it, I don't want to term it as Gandhian, but it's very, similar to Gandhian way of living and thinking, right? Whereby we are more thinking about change of heart, or, a deeper consciousness, or a better understanding of ourselves or society's ills. But in times of such crises, can we wait for these things to happen, or do we require something more urgent?
Well, I've tried to do those urgent things for the last 30 years. I negotiated the Climate Change Convention. I went to the Second World Climate Conference in 1990. I worked with the world to negotiate the convention, which we signed in May 1992, and then at Rio. And I've watched the evolution, including at Paris. And this year, or last year, we have emitted more greenhouse gases than we ever did. So keep doing your urgent stuff and see if it works. Urgent crisis, isn't it? Urgent since 1990. So where are we? So I wrote a paper on consciousness and climate change, which I can share with you, on why I think it will work better. Now, but let me also say, and this is far from Gandhian, the self-reliance part might appear to be Gandhian. It might even appear to be Deen Dayal and so on. I have just been invited. I'm trying to find how to do it, to two things because they are clashing. I've been invited to go to Davos, to the World Economic Forum. So at this World Economic Forum, the kind of people that go there? All the top CEOs of the world, all the top politicians of the world. So these guys, a bunch of CEOs have come together and they're hiring a mountaintop. Davos is in a valley. In this mountaintop, we will have a separate side event at which 5, 6 people like myself have been invited to talk to the CEOs because they want to talk about the role of consciousness in their leadership to their own corporations. They're all billionaires. This sounds like Gandhian to you? No. So the problem I have is because I have to come back for another meeting in Bangalore, which is the next day, on the 24th of January, I think, in which they have a festival. They are looking at the future of Bangalore. And they're saying, we want to talk about systems thinking and spirituality to help guide the transition to where Bangalore might go. So we will be talking of water and health and education, and what shifts do you make when you use these principles? Yeah. Right. Please, sir.
I'm Nayan. I teach here. Somewhat of similar questions. I quite love what you did initially. I have been also doing, even in my PhD, my thing was...
Not talking to the things of you.
Yeah. So even my PhD, my framework was multi-scalar ethnography of scales, and specifically around complexities, specifically to do with self-organization and emergence also I tried to look. But anyway, it was similar, which is, if I can be a bit critical, this rocket on the moon vis-a-vis child raising that you're saying. So the child raising point that you made was about changing oneself also. No, I mean along with the
Well, I was
child.
just trying to illustrate adaptive evolution.
Yeah. But also in the sense of who is doing it. I mean, in terms of, if we talk about development, then the institutions or the centers who are doing it, such a framework is excellent, and it can maybe give you, and I think even in social theory, forget development, but even in social sciences and so on, the concept of uncertainty and so on needs to be integrated into the core of such theory, for sure. Then the thing is, then who wields it and for what purpose? That question will come, which was the first question and so on also. Yeah, I'm just putting it as a confusion thing because, is it then again DFID who will remain where they are and we have to do behavioral change? Or can we then understand through this framework and then maybe propose something else? Of course, Truman invented it. It can, now I don't know if after Trump, what they are going to do with themselves.
Yeah, they won't have
So
any
if they leave us alone, like if they leave the environment alone, then maybe we can take some of these ideas and propose something else altogether. I mean, that was the thing. Related to that is this transcendence. Like, it's interesting, and it's of course great that one is kind of going back also, like sum of parts. I mean, the whole is more than sum of parts, like going back to Hegel and all. So, I mean, transcendence, then, this individual thing, I mean, it's also transcending of the individual to a more social whole, you know, like the spirituality aspect takes you to more greed, individual needs, etc. And of course, one needs to take that into account, because finally it's about a meditation on needs also, on a social level, on an individual and a social level, and that is the actual transformation that's probably required. But then if one thinks of it on a more social level thing, rather than on an individual spiritual level, maybe, I mean, I read it like that. I like the thing. Maybe from the individual transcendence, it then transforms back into society rather.
Let me answer that. See, if you listen to a set of theoretical concepts and you try to deduce practice, you're going to fail. So let me give you how to practice. Many of what I shared with you came from practice to theory, not the traditional way from theory into practice. So when the theory doesn't fit the world, you change the world to fit your theory, right? So your theory must stay intact, isn't it? At least academically, that's what we do, some of us. Let me give you an example of the sustainable livelihoods approach, how it works. When you go to a poor community, you don't start with their needs. You start with what they have. That one single shift, you know what you have done? You are now connecting with their energy. So when we work with livelihoods, what are we working with? Livelihood is defined to mean activities. Activities are either wage labor or small micro business. Both of those things people are doing. But they also have assets. Those assets can be physical, social, human, natural, whatever. What they don't have is normally physical and economic assets. But they normally have human, social, and natural assets are there. And then entitlements means what the state will provide. Public goods and services. But we start with what they have, not with what they need. In social capital, religion is there. In human capital, spirituality is there. When you work with villages in Africa and you start with what people have, not with what they need, you connect to a different level and source of energy. Then, the next thing you do is a visioning exercise where the people define what will be a more sustainable livelihood based upon their asset base. So it doesn't become a wish list. Third step is, what can you do on your own to get to your vision? Then only do we have the question, what do you need from outsiders that you cannot do on your own? That might mean money, technology, whatever else. So that's how it works. All of these things I'm telling you about is built into that process. And it leads to poverty eradication in a different way, where people take the leadership, and you have macro-micro linkages as well. But let me give you another example of the one I led, which is called legal empowerment of the poor. How does that process work? It works first by people articulating commonly what is their problem. And there's nothing rocket science here. It's all like bringing up the child, right? So they articulate what is their problem. Then you form groups. You mobilize, which is standard mobilization. Third step is contestation. Now you must contest against the elite, the establishment. Now, poor people can't win against the elite, right? They're going to get crushed. Nevertheless, they will contest. I'll show you how they win. And then the final step, when they do win, if they win, gets confirmation in law, the law must change to reflect the new thing, right? Like social movements, Gandhian or Martin Luther King, whoever. And among them, you get charismatic leaders. That's the process. It captures all of what we just said, but it doesn't use any of these words. How do they win? They win when you are able to conceptualize power as a positive sum game, not a zero sum. That is to say, you have to find win-win. You have to find ways in which when you want to get that child out of bonded labor, you have to show the employer what's in it for him. Otherwise you can't win. That is how we have practiced these principles. It has nothing to do with these words, but then we theorized and we come to these things.
Thank you so much for that thought-provoking lecture. Huh? Yeah, I'm Gayatri. I teach here.
Yes, Gayatri.
Yeah, hi. So I have 3 questions, or like rather 3 thoughts which I could want. One is the idea of shunya or oneness is also beyond disciplines or like conceptual categories which have been developed as part of post-World War, etc. Right? So it's not with understanding economy alone or development economics alone. The idea which predates several centuries, which you rightly forward, like it's something that's beyond all this larger unity that we are talking about. So, what does it give us when we are? Do we also then reduce the larger potential of, or like this thinking about shunya or oneness by bringing it down to understanding it in a very applied way to understand development economics, or like the world is today, like interventionist.
Like make it instrumental.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
yes,
I
that's
know.
the word.
I know what you mean.
The second is related to that. Then, but then we talk about development economics or development practice. There's this very famous dialogue in the Parasite movie, right? When the worker says, "I'll be nice if I was rich." So
Yeah,
there
the
is.
Parasite. Oh, yeah, I saw that.
So the thing is, there's a larger question of materialism of spirituality as well, right? So the rich are not reluctant to be spiritual or believe in the idea of oneness or the interconnectedness, etc. But they are very reluctant to the idea of a redistribution or giving away your land to the poor, etc. So what we see in a very practical level is people who go for like a different kind of, I think there's a resurgence of all these concepts also, which I absolutely agree. I mean, I'm for the spiritual awakening, but there's a larger reluctance for a material giving up you will than like a spiritual giving up, right? So can there be ever this sort of a oneness with people owning resources which works so differently than it is? Again, this connects to my third question. So neoclassical economics didn't it was not a gradual transition to behavioral economics, right? So there was also larger overlooking of other heterodox approaches and an attention which behavioral economics gets now, the other heterodox approaches never got. So there's and behavioral economics even got Nobel Prize. So then how do you then see this in the larger schema of the other two? Thank you so much.
3 nice interconnected questions. So the first one is that it is true. I accept that when we talk about applied spirituality, by definition, we are making it instrumental. And the power of understanding one's own true nature might be lost in that process to some extent. I think in order to try and get people along, we need to make that trade-off. So that's a deliberate trade-off that we make, a kind of a dilution of the ideas in order to get people on board. And it's in the transition. But we have to ensure that in that space, we don't lose our North Star, that guide remains there. And that is why it doesn't take long to understand who you are. There is the direct path of self-realization. It could happen in a moment. It might take you a few days. If you're deeply interested in the problems of the world, and why is it? You see, what I did was after 30 years of working in the public sphere and looking at what I achieved, that's when I went to what I do now. So then we have to grapple with these realities. What we find is that the fragmentation at the level of human consciousness is the real source of the problem. And you don't even have to use the word spiritual. If you talk about fragmentation of consciousness, that's why we just wrote this new book called From Fragmentation to Wholeness. You see, the word holism is an oxymoron. It does not exist. We all say holistic. Take a holistic approach. And then I ask you to go do a holistic approach. See what would happen. It doesn't work because we are fragmented ourselves. So from fragmentation to wholeness, we talk about direct seeing. We are drawing from two big thinkers, really. One is David Bohm, who was a physicist, and the other one is Krishnamurti, Jiddu Krishnamurti. How do you get rid of the conditioning of the mind, which is what we are suffering from? And we have applied that to public policy and SDGs and so on. So that's where I think that connection will be made. So whether we lose the purity and so on that was taught in the scriptures, that's not what we're into, and we don't care about that. But understanding where fragmentation comes from, where the possibility of wholeness, the systems word that I use, we are going in a way different way of understanding that systems. Because I tried it and I failed too with a classical approach in the books. The next point is the issue of how do we deal with all these disciplines. I am talking to you in an academic setting. So I am only way to converse with you is to talk about these disciplines. So we wrote a paper which is not yet published either, and it's called MITD. It's multi, inter, and transdisciplinary. So what we are trying to do in that paper is to explain from the literature what is the understanding, what is the meaning of multidisciplinary approaches, including in practice and higher education, what is interdisciplinary approaches, what is the commonly understood practices and in higher education, and then transdisciplinary. So our approach will only happen through a transdisciplinary approach. What is that transdisciplinary approach and how is this distinct from interdisciplinary? Well, the simple answer is that in the transdisciplinary approach, you get practitioners, community members to help you define your research question. And then you proceed with an interdisciplinary approach. When you do that, these ideas just help you to understand. You don't have to start with the ideas or the discipline. You start with the problem. And then you see this unfolding. So we struggled for a while in how will we do this in practice? And I think we will have to start with education. So we will have to get a whole bunch of teachers retrained so that they can start teaching from primary school right through. And that the transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary ways of thinking and practice will become natural rather than imposed on us who were guinea pigged and we did disciplines. So when you ask me how would I integrate something into some other academic scholar from somewhere, or when our friend says, okay, somebody talked about the sum of the parts, never as big as the whole, they were all there. This is nothing new. I'm only saying that these theoretical principles help to explain the practice of what we do. But the way we do it is very different. So the next book I think we need to write, the final book, and then go silently into the night. The final book will have to be how to revolutionize the education system to make this happen. Then it will take, of course, 20 years. But paradigms don't shift in 20 years or 30 years. They normally take 300 or 400 years. If you make a study of significant paradigm shifts, I think you will find it take about 300 years or so. So we are starting. In 300 years, please come back and you will see the answers. I don't know if that helps, but that's where we're at.
Thank you so much, Professor Singh, for this very interesting and productive talk.
All right, wonderful session. I hope you all had a lot to absorb. I've had the distinct pleasure and sort of honor of spending a lot of time in the company of Dr. Naresh Singh, and I've learned so much from his company. And I'm so glad that he could share his time today with all of you. I have a couple of quick sort of just reflections which may be of much, I guess, value for the students who are currently part of the program. And we would probably propose to Sir that through your center, the center which is focusing more on applied spirituality and human development policy, we think about doing maybe an in-house 1-day or 2-day workshop where there is a more immersive experience of that space, and that could probably bring out the perspectives beyond the intellect. Right now we are sort of grappling between what the intellect cannot possibly do, and where is that this possibility of the difference or gap bridge between self-realization, self-transcendence, and material sort of acquisition. It may require a lot more energy on your part, but we can probably think about this, because that can then become a template for doing this more often than not in other institutions. There is a very interesting way in which Dr. Singh and his work has brought out. I mean, if you get a chance to read some of what he has published in the last, I would have seen 6-7 years, but longer than that period, is that he has used a disciplinic approach to institutionalize and also intellectualize post-disciplinarity. I've added another sort of term, which is that you have gone often outside disciplines and taken an academic approach in this sort of nobler, pragmatic way, with a tinge of a radical mind, while accepting that there are traditional disciplinary approaches that are vital and important, but we need to use a problem-oriented and centric approach to resolve those. And how can we do that is by coming up with new ideas, frameworks, principles. And I think sometimes what happens when you do something which is being done from an observatory point, from a learning set point, or from evolving or adjusting to existing paradigms, there's always a lot of question about whether we are doing it, quote unquote, the right way, whether it is being done for the right people, whether it is being done for those who are eager to understand its sort of depth. I think a lot of that becomes clear sometimes in your own lifetime, or otherwise in a period after that, where your physical presence may or may not be relevant. And I think that is a very crucial aspect of his work. I feel a lot of what perhaps we are doing in the company of your presence may stand to go back, and we will keep going back to this years and years and decades down the line. A lot that you have said, and I've had the sort of pleasure of listening to you in many different settings, including some very provocative discussions. A lot of people are right now still grappled with the distinction of binaries between practice, theory, development, growth, urban, rural, a lot of those frame. And it is about time that in the next sort of few years, this will sort of get out of the language. It's already happening in many circles. Some of the many best institutions don't no longer use, they say that you're from an ancient medieval setup. They'll not even entertain you in a seminar room. But here, I think somewhere within our own culture, we can stand to gain a lot more. So with that keeping in mind, we'll look to train students as searchers, not as planners. I think that is a very important lesson. Your emphasis on trying to embrace complexity, chaos, context, the 3 C's would be a very vital recognition. And I want to thank all the faculty members, the students who've been here, students who came in from Delhi University. They've been our eager attendees for almost all masterclass sessions. This is also our final masterclass session in person for this trimester. I want to thank each one of the students. They have been very regular in attending all of these. You are not obligated to attend, but I think we can take this example and take to JGU students in residence, who we often hunt to attend very interesting sessions. but you have been an always eager audience. I want to thank Dr. Prachi, soon to be Dr. Prachi, but Professor Prachi, who has been extremely kind, generous with her time in organizing these. She has been phenomenal. Round of applause for Prachi. I want to thank also our executive team, Sakib, soon to be Dr. Sakib, and Nasima and Nirmal. All three of them have been phenomenal. It takes a lot of work behind the scenes.